A week had passed since the tragic night Mrs. Crane was found lifeless in the rain-soaked street. Detective James Callahan, still reeling from personal loss and the haunting events of that murder, sat in the commissioner's office, half listening as thunder rumbled outside. The faint odor of stale coffee permeated the small room, and overhead lights flickered with every distant roar of lightning. Commissioner Barnes, a stout man with weary eyes, studied Callahan for a moment before speaking. "Jimmy," he said, voice edged with genuine worry, "I can't have you working solo on these cases anymore. Not in your state. You're brilliant, but you're hurting." Callahan averted his gaze, trying to suppress the memory of his wife's final moments and the weight of the unsolved murders. "That's why," the commissioner continued gently, "I'm assigning you a partner, Detective Lydia Monroe. She's one of my best, sharp, dedicated. But more than that, she can keep an eye on you." Callahan stiffened, hating the pity in Barnes's eyes, but he had no grounds to protest. The shadows in his life were gathering, and deep down, he knew he couldn't face them alone. Later that evening, Callahan was clearing old case files from his cluttered desk when he felt a presence at the door. He turned to see Detective Lydia Monroe. Tall, dark-haired, and possessing a quiet poise, she radiated a resolve he found both unsettling and oddly comforting. "Detective Callahan," she greeted, offering a hand. Her voice was soft but self-assured, carrying a warmth that contrasted with the cold demeanor of the station's fluorescent lights. If Callahan had been more attuned to the subtleties of the heart, he might have noticed the brief glimmer in her eyes, an affection she could not quite hide. "Monroe," he replied, shaking her hand. "Commissioner says you're here to keep me out of trouble." The ghost of a smile crossed Lydia's lips. "I'm here to help solve these murders. But yes, if keeping you out of trouble is part of that, I'll do my best." Unbeknownst to Callahan, Lydia had requested this assignment out of more than just duty. A flicker of concern, and something deeper, burned behind her calm exterior. But if the detective was aware of her feelings, he did a fine job pretending otherwise. While the two detectives navigated their new partnership, Tommy was busy following his own trail of breadcrumbs. At 15, he was resourceful beyond his years, driven by the guilt of witnessing Mrs. Crane's lifeless form and an insatiable desire to prove himself to Detective Callahan. One rainy afternoon, Tommy slipped into an old storage room behind a dilapidated warehouse by the docks. Lured by rumors of strange footsteps and muffled voices, he crept through shadows until he found a soggy, half-burned folder. Its brittle pages revealed cryptic references to covert research, signed off with the initials R.A.Z. He had seen those letters scrawled on a piece of paper near Mrs. Crane's body, a fleeting detail he hadn't grasped until now. Heart pounding with excitement, he held the folder close, water dripping onto his sneakers as thunder rumbled overhead. Whatever these initials signified, they had to be the key to unmasking the city's elusive killer. That same evening, Tommy rushed to the precinct, folder tucked under his arm. He arrived drenched, hair plastered to his forehead, cheeks flushed with both adrenaline and the chill of the downpour. Stepping carefully around the scattered desks and buzzing phones, he found Callahan and Lydia in the cramped interrogation room. With a determined gleam in his eyes, Tommy produced the soaked folder. "I found this near the old dock warehouses," he said, voice trembling with both fear and excitement. "Some sort of project records, and these letters, R.A.Z., they were on a note by Mrs. Crane, too." Callahan stiffened. He and Lydia exchanged a glance. In the flickering overhead light, Lydia's gaze sparkled with intrigue, while Callahan's lined face betrayed a hint of unease. What had begun as a simple murder case was morphing into something deeper, darker, and far more personal. The following morning, Commissioner Barnes summoned Callahan and Lydia to his office. A along with an unexpectedly invited guest, Tommy. Barnes, perched behind his old wooden desk, eyed the boy with a mixture of concern and frustration. "I don't usually let civilians, especially minors, near active investigations," he said, tapping a pen on a stack of official forms. "But Tommy here seems entangled in this case, whether we like it or not." Lydia frowned slightly. "Sir, we can't put him in danger." "No," Barnes agreed, "but we can't ignore the fact that he's found some crucial evidence. I want you both to keep an eye on him. Officially or not, you'll work together until we solve these murders. And by solve, I mean identify whoever's behind those initials and lock them up before more bodies show up." Callahan ran a hand through his graying hair. Ever since his personal life had fallen apart, all he wanted was to disappear into the next case. But now, fate was forcing him to take responsibility for the boy, for Lydia, and for a city that grew darker by the day. Buried deep within the blurred text of the salvaged folder, the trio stumbled upon references to a defunct government project rumored to have manipulated human genetics. Lydia spent countless hours cross-referencing the cryptic notes with old police records, her brow furrowed in fierce concentration. Coffee cups multiplied on her desk, testament to her relentless pursuit of the truth. Some of the pages described a hybrid prototype designated as R.A.Z. It was unclear whether R.A.Z. was a codename, a subject number, or something else, but every line hinted at a creation that should never have existed. Each revelation sparked more questions, and behind it all loomed the chilling suspicion that the masked man terrorizing their city might be the end product of this buried experiment. Late one night, as the precinct's hallways emptied and only the soft hum of distant computer monitors remained, Lydia approached Callahan at his desk. Darkness settled in the corners of the room like an unwelcome guest, and a single lamp illuminated the scattered case files between them. "You've been quieter than usual," Lydia said, her voice threaded with empathy. "You hardly sleep, and you barely eat. This case, it's getting to you, isn't it?" Callahan met her concerned gaze, his eyes reflecting a haunted resignation. "It's not just the case," he admitted gruffly. "It's everything. My wife's passing, these murders, the sense that I'm chasing a ghost. I just can't shake the feeling that I'm missing something vital, something personal." For a moment, Lydia hesitated, torn between wanting to comfort him and the risk of revealing her deeper feelings. "You're not alone," she murmured finally, placing a hand gently on his arm. If Callahan noticed the trembling in her touch, he gave no sign of it. In a small break room at the precinct, Tommy flipped through the waterlogged pages he'd salvaged. Rows of text blurred and smudged into near illegibility, but certain phrases jumped out. Subject number 7, Advanced Hybridization, and Donor, J.C. Tommy's heart jolted. J.C. could be James Callahan. But how? Before he could process the implications, Lydia and Callahan strode into the room. A curt nod later, the three of them huddled around the battered file, each realization piling on top of the last. This can't be right," Callahan muttered, brow knitted in disbelief. "I never signed up for any government program, let alone genetic experiments." Lydia inhaled sharply. "The text implies the subject, R.A.Z., might share your DNA, possibly without your knowledge. These notes reference stolen samples, secret labs, things from years ago." A creeping dread slithered into the pit of Callahan's stomach. If the masked man truly was some twisted doppelganger, then every murder, every haunting encounter, was more than just random violence. It was personal. As if to confirm their growing fears, fresh reports began flooding in. More bodies discovered in remote corners of the city, each bearing the same chilling hallmark, a single black thread reminiscent of a long coat, and the faint traces of someone wearing a featureless mask. Grief settled over the precinct like a suffocating fog. Callahan, Lydia, and Tommy pored over each new crime scene photo, frustration mounting with every dead end. The battered city reeled under the masked man's reign of terror, and tension at the station grew thick enough to cut with a knife. Rumors swirled about a superhuman killer, some supernatural force impervious to the police's efforts. Each day without answers wore on Callahan's conscience, deepening the dark circles under his eyes. Lydia tried to offer quiet support, longing to bridge the gap between them with more than just words. But the detective, oblivious, remained doggedly focused on the case, all else be damned. A witness finally stepped forward, an elderly gentleman who claimed to have glimpsed a tall figure in a black coat sneaking away from a derelict barn on the edge of town. The farm had been abandoned for years, the old man said, its fields choked with weeds and the house left to rot. With their new lead in hand, Callahan, Lydia, and Tommy set out at dusk. The ride was tense, headlights cutting swaths through the gathering gloom as thunderheads loomed in the distance. Lydia drove, her jaw set, while Callahan clutched the steering wheel from the passenger seat, knuckles white. Tommy huddled in the back, eyes wide with mingled fear and anticipation. In the hush between bursts of thunder, Lydia cast a sidelong glance at Callahan. In that moment, her unspoken emotions hovered in the air, a quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, he'd return her gaze with a hint of understanding. But he remained lost in thought, haunted by the possibility that he was about to confront a monstrous reflection of himself. They reached the farm just as the first lightning forked across the sky. The property was a skeletal shell of its former self, sagging fences, broken windows, and a porch that groaned in protest with every gust of wind. The air hung heavy with the scent of wet earth and decay. Callahan stepped onto the muddy ground, heart thudding in his chest. Tommy followed, swallowing hard, and Lydia joined them, her hand instinctively hovering near the holster on her hip. The trio moved in a tight formation, each feeling the weight of the secret that lay just beyond the rotting door. No one spoke, but the tension crackled as loudly as the distant thunder. Here, amidst the twisted remnants of rural life, they would unearth the final puzzle piece, a truth that could tear their lives apart. Inside the farmhouse, the walls were covered with faded wallpaper, curling at the edges. Lightning flashes through broken windows cast jagged shadows on splintered furniture. Each echoing footstep felt like an intrusion into a place long forgotten by time. In the back room, they found unsettling evidence, scattered notes, beakers still crusted with strange residues, and metal restraints bolted to a table. It was as though a cruel experiment had taken place here, one that defied both morality and nature. Tommy exhaled shakily. "Do you think this is where they made him?" Lydia glanced at Callahan, whose gaze lingered on a series of half-burned files. "If these notes are right," she murmured, "this might be where R.A.Z. was perfected, or at least unleashed." A crash of thunder outside rattled the farmhouse, and Callahan suppressed a shudder, half expecting the masked figure to step from the darkness at any moment. Suddenly, a floorboard creaked behind them. They turned to see the silhouette of a man, tall, swathed in a black coat, face hidden behind a featureless mask. His breathing was an eerie rasp beneath the howling wind. Despite the mask, Callahan felt a visceral jolt of recognition, as though facing his own reflection in a distorted mirror. The figure moved with unnatural speed, lunging forward. Lydia drew her weapon, heart pounding. Gunshots echoed in the cramped space, muzzle flashes strobing through the gloom. The masked man ducked behind rotting beams, the house splintering under the onslaught. In the chaos, Tommy cowered behind a toppled cabinet, fear warring with the courage that had carried him this far. Meanwhile, Callahan pressed forward, each step fueled by an inescapable sense of destiny. If R.A.Z. was truly his double, a twisted hybrid, then stopping him would mean confronting the darkest aspects of himself. Amid the cracking thunder and flickering lantern light, R.A.Z. cornered Callahan. For a moment, the two faced each other in silence, the living man and the science-forged copy. Lightning illuminated the mask's blank features, revealing subtle scars beneath. In a voice cold and distorted, R.A.Z. hissed, "You're the reason I exist. Your DNA, your life, belongs to me." A wave of revulsion twisted Callahan's stomach. He raised his gun, voice trembling with fury and heartbreak. "Whatever you are, you won't take another life." Before R.A.Z. could respond, Lydia stepped from the shadows, pistol aimed. She fired, the bullet striking the masked man's shoulder with a spray of sparks and blood. With an agonized snarl, he collapsed against the wall, the mask cracking to reveal half of a face, strangely identical to Callahan's own. Tommy gasped, stricken by the horrific realization. By the time dawn broke, the wind and rain had subsided to a gentle whisper. The farmhouse stood quiet, its secrets exposed. R.A.Z. lay unconscious, pinned down by hastily fashioned restraints. An ambulance and backup officers arrived, the flashing lights bathing the property in garish red and blue. Callahan watched from the sidelines, the weight of truth pressing down upon him. He had faced a creation woven from his own genetic fibers, a living sin conjured by unscrupulous government agents. Lydia, sensing his turmoil, gently placed a hand on his shoulder. He turned to her, finally seeing in her eyes a warmth that transcended partnership. Tommy approached, solemn and wide-eyed. "Detective Callahan," he said quietly. "What happens now?" Callahan took a shuddering breath, gazing at the rising sun over the dilapidated farm. "We get answers," he replied, voice thick with emotion. "We expose those responsible for Project R.A.Z. And we keep going, together." A flicker of unspoken feeling shone in Lydia's eyes, but she simply gave Callahan a grateful nod. The old horrors hadn't vanished, but under that morning light, they all sensed a fragile new beginning. For the first time in a long while, the detective allowed himself a glimmer of hope.